This hour, we have weird stories from the blockchain. Our next teacher has over 16 years of experience in operations, technology, business, and product management. He's been involved in cryptocurrency space since 2012, and so you know he has some good stories to tell today. He's currently the COO of ShapeShift, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Jon Shapeshift.
All right, so that's on. So all 5 of you can hear me. Great, so happy to be here and very excited that I was invited to come speak at this. I'm trying kind of because I had to focus based on the conference into learning objectives, the style of this talk is a little different than something I've done before, and I'm interested to see how it works out, so hopefully you all like it. So I'm just going to kind of dive into it. My title for this talk is Weird Stories from the Blockchain because my goal here is to actually just recount some perspective from various experiences, both on things that have happened in the industry that are very well known, and my perspective on them, because in a lot of cases I was like in the middle of them, or things that are not as well known. And as we go through this, I'll try to recount some various lessons and reflections from these stories, and maybe there'll be a little time for Q&A at the end. So getting started, who the hell am I? Well, my name is Jon. That's pretty straightforward. I became fascinated by Bitcoin, eventually, referred to more colloquially as crypto, but certainly by Bitcoin in about 2012. And at the time, I was running one of the first digital agencies to take Bitcoin as payment. Which actually led, kind of in one of those weird, ironic paths of life, to the creation of ShapeShift, because Eric Voorhees, our CEO, found that agency because it took Bitcoin specifically. We'd only put the Bitcoin accepted sticker up there maybe, a month or 2 before he contacted us. And that was actually, one of the creation stories, the genesis of ShapeShift. So in 2014, I helped create ShapeShift and became the COO and co-founder, and I've been there ever since. We have quite a few people here from ShapeShift, and we got a booth out there, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what ShapeShift is, although I'd be happy to talk about that later if anyone has any questions, but for now I'm just going to assume you have basic knowledge of that. My background is mostly, as an entrepreneur in operations, building and managing technical teams, technical project management, and a little bit of everything. I like to say when you're an entrepreneur and when you're focused on operations, that means very different things for very different organizations, and it kind of depends what you need at the time. So you kind of inevitably become a jack of all trades that has to do a bit of everything, because when you're an entrepreneur, you don't usually have a lot of other hands to turn to, at least in the early stages. And I'm a philosophy major, and that is both a blessing and a curse, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through here. So as we're talking today, a few themes to pay attention to. One, I'm going to touch a little bit on the philosophical underpinnings of crypto and what a blockchain is. Even at this conference, we talk about as if this is like a very well-defined, accepted definition of this is a blockchain, and it's really not. There's a lot of debate even what that exactly means and what qualifies and what doesn't, and it's an interesting question to ask. I'm going to focus a lot on the fact that blockchains are a lot more than just a technology. It's a lot different when applied in practice than just a bunch of code like other software projects, and they have a lot of other effects on them. We'll talk about that. And finally, there are many perspectives and truths. This is my philosophy side coming out, but one cool thing about crypto is the code either works or it doesn't to some degree. Now, sometimes it doesn't work in the way you thought it was going to work, as we'll talk about, but generally either it does something or it doesn't do something. So, getting started with our first story, I'm going to talk a little bit about the DAO. Many of you have probably heard of this, but back in whatever time this was, 2016 approximately, I think, there was this creation of this idea as Ethereum was exploding called the DAO. And this was a very interesting concept at the time. It was the idea of let's pool a bunch of money in a smart contract and let the smart contract make decisions about what to do with that money. And the idea was to, as much as we could, remove the human element. And this was a really interesting idea, is that instead of having like a traditional corporation, you could have a blockchain entity that essentially was robotic and operated via code, and could actually make some of these decisions with the decentralized stakeholders and all those type of fun things. Now, this, many of you know about this. This will get interesting. So I became very interested in it when I heard about it. I thought it was really cool. I started talking a little bit with the people who were trying to organize this, and it was this company called Slockit at the time, and they actually created the DAO basically as a way so that they, as a separate entity, could get funding for what they wanted to do with their startup, but they wanted to create this whole other thing that ended up becoming way bigger than their company and what they ever expected of that could invest in multiple companies, almost like a decentralized venture capital firm or something like this, but they didn't call it that, and it was all still very experimental at this time. So we got involved in it. ShapeShift actually got integrated in the initial creation event so that you could easily contribute and help creation of the DAO through whatever currency you want. That was pretty cool. And then when we first started doing it, they didn't expect that much, and then before you know it, something close to they expected maybe 10 million max, and then all of a sudden they had $15 million worth of F in this thing, 20 million, and then people started to realize very quickly that this probably wasn't going to stop. And it didn't stop until the creation event was over, and we had something like somewhere over $150 million worth of ETH in this smart contract. And this was in the very early days of ETH when the price was not that high, and this was something like, I think at the time, like upwards of 10 or 15% of all Ethereum in circulation that were in this one contract in the very early days. Might be a problem. We'll find out. So I remember being at a conference in Vienna about a week after this creation event. So the DAO was in effect. People were all talking about it. It was all over the news. This robotic piece of code had raised $150 million out of nowhere, and it was a very interesting subject. And I remember reading a quote from Christoph, one of the main engineers who worked at Slockit at the time, who helped engineer a lot of the DAO code. And his quote was pretty much exactly this: if I knew how much money people were going to be putting into it, I would have wanted us to do a lot more testing. And I remember reading that and thinking, I sure hope that's not prophetic. Unfortunately, it was. So about, I can't remember exactly when, but no more than about 30 days after this thing was created, I got woken up. I think it was about 3 or 4 a.m. my time, and a group of various exchanges and other people that I was in chat channels with were all going nuts because essentially something had been detected on chain and something had gone wrong with the DAO. It turns out that a hacker had exploited a piece in the smart contract code and was able to essentially siphon out $40 million worth of ETH before anyone could do anything about it, and essentially freeze the contract. So this was a huge deal. I was working with various exchanges. We were trying to help track this stuff, but then we all kind of figured out that because of the way the DAO had been created, it would be trapped for about 30 days. And this set off kind of a time clock for the ETH community to try to figure out this problem, because they had 30 days before the hacker could actually gain full access to those funds that they had siphoned off. And at some point, we'll talk about this later, once that eventually happened, we were having to help actually manually chase this around the chain. But the interesting thing is that this caused one of the first major forks in the crypto industry, and it really had a lot of philosophical implications. It was very interesting, and this whole debate sprung up about immutability and whether this mattered for a blockchain, how much it matters, all that type of stuff. And the debate was raging, and it had a lot of philosophical implications, it had technological implications, it had economical implications, political, psychological, you name it. All of these factors start coming into play for this thing that's just supposed to be a technology, and you get the community splitting up into various factions and camps with different takes on how to deal with this. Ultimately, this would lead to a fork in the Ethereum blockchain, and you'd have the creation of the Ethereum Classic. I'll talk a little bit more about this fork later, but this was really kind of an existential moment for Ethereum and the entire blockchain community. So some things we learned about this particular event. One is, we can't say this enough, but really test things. We at ShapeShift have this ethos that we call testnet schmeshnet, meaning just because it works on testnet doesn't mean the same thing's gonna happen on mainnet or even more as you scale, and you should really take that to heart. As we've been through this over time, we've seen this kind of proved over and over and over again. Growth can happen really fast in crypto. Nobody expected the DAO to explode like it did, but honestly, given the climate and what can happen in crypto, they should have been a little more prepared for at least that eventuality. Like Christoph said, they probably would have wanted to test more if they thought people were going to throw the kind of money at it that they did, but they just didn't expect that to happen so quickly. So don't underestimate how fast a good idea can take off, and try to be ready. Test for world beater scenarios, because otherwise things can explode very quickly. When you run into one of these things, you don't really have a lot of time to react and scale. The double-edged sword of smart contracts. When Ethereum first started, there was this real mantra of code is law, and people being really excited about this idea of removing the middlemen, having code do everything. But there's a problem in that if a smart contract code is unchangeable, it's a double-edged sword. You can get cut by this, and it's really interesting when you see essentially the collision of these philosophies. The traditional tech philosophy of move fast and break things does not go very well with a code is law philosophy on the other end of that. And these two things were really kind of at odds and meshing with each other, and this was the result we had. Crypto is far more than just tech. The resulting fork shows how philosophically crypto projects are much more than just code. Realize this impact, the power of the community, and how psychological and philosophical factors can influence what happens to projects in big ways. This is quite different than a lot of traditional tech projects where you might have degrees of this influence, but it's not as strong. You don't have economically incentivized stakeholders throughout the industry, many of which who can't be known or don't, essentially just vote with their technology. And these really caused splits. People had debates about all these things. What should the economic system be in a situation like this? Was Ethereum early enough that this could be wrote up as an experiment and the fork was okay? All right. All right, resuming normal activities. But they're still going to talk. All right, we're very clear. So this is different than many traditional tech projects where you don't have a lot of these influences. And this really showed this, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go. So the next thing I'll talk about, and this is something almost everyone in the industry has experienced at one point in time, are various types of attacks on individuals in the industry. Learning how to protect yourself is really important no matter what level of target you think you might be. So I myself experienced a personal attack very early on in my ShapeShift career. I think it was 2015, and I had almost next to no real public profile or my name attached to much about crypto, but it didn't matter. Some hacker figured out that I was in here, and I was using, at the time, what were considered relatively secure setups. I was using a password manager, two-factor on my accounts. I didn't have a lot of information out there. Relatively, I did not have a huge target pasted on my back, but it didn't matter. I actually got attacked at a baseball game. I noticed that I was getting all these various alerts on my phone. It was like the third or fourth inning or something, and I'm like, oh, what's going on? And realized that a hacker had actually taken over my email account, my personal email, and I still to this day don't know exactly how they got in because it didn't have terrible security on it, but they did. I start seeing these alerts. I start trying to respond to it in real time. In retrospect, it looks like they likely SIM swapped my phone in some regard, although I'm still not even 100% on that. But they used that to get into my personal email. They start attacking various accounts, like at the time my Coinbase account and other things. And even ones with full two-factor. They were somehow able to exploit that. Two-factor did not fully protect me. Some of those cases may be because certain websites at that time only had SMS two-factor, which is very vulnerable to SIM swap attacks. And some of it is systems like Authy allowed for phone recovery and other things that if I had known better at the time, I would have had turned off. Any two-factor you have, you really don't want it to be accessible to anything but the one device that you're using it on, or you're probably going to have problems, and I did at the time. So I'm trying to respond in real time to this attack as it's happening. I'm trying to lock down things. I was lucky in that I did notice it as it was happening, and I was able to essentially start logging into my accounts from my phone and trying to push the hacker out as best as I could. And this kind of went on the rest of the night. And even to the point where the hacker started texting me directly and tried to ransom me my email back to me, try getting him to send him more Bitcoin. I was actually very lucky in that literally about a month before this, a lot of Bitcoin that I had on Coinbase at the time that I knew should not be on there, I had just moved recently into a hardware wallet, and so the hacker did not fortunately get much access to much of my actual crypto, but he was able to use Coinbase and my instant buy to buy a bunch of Bitcoin and instantly send it to himself and other things that were not very fun to deal with. So again, I was lucky, and the biggest thing that is still very prominent in the space is because I used a hardware wallet. And in general, that's a really good practice. Get your keys on hardware. You're probably going to have way less of an issue than anyone else who doesn't use hardware. I ended up losing my personal email because I was not willing to negotiate with this guy. And in retrospect, even though I lost a lot of data and I had that email for almost 15 years or something, it really sucked to lose. It was still probably the right decision. The hacker wanted 10 Bitcoin. At the time, it wasn't that much money, but I'm very glad I did not part with that 10 Bitcoin. And it's generally not a great idea. And to negotiate with hackers, and the reality was I could have sent him the Bitcoin and he could have not given me my access back anyway. There was no guarantees. And you don't really want to trust someone who just maliciously attacked your account. Your info is likely out there, whether you admit it to yourself or not. I mean, this is something that I really learned through this, is it doesn't matter what your profile level is, it doesn't matter how big of a target you think you are, how much information is out there about you. We all have our info out there. If you've ever had to use a credit card, if you've ever had to have a credit report run, we all know about Equifax and that big hack that happened. The information's all over the place. It's not that hard to get. Hackers are likely rummaging through this stuff all the time, just trying to find whatever they can knock over and whatever they can pull out. So what did I learn from this particular personal incident? One is just you're a target. It doesn't matter. If you, regardless of the profile you keep, regardless of how deep you are into crypto, take basic personal security very easily. There's a lot of basic things you can do. I'm not going to turn this into a long-form security talk, but there's a lot of good people even here at this conference that are giving a lot of good information about this. Take it seriously. Do basic things. Use a password manager. Use two-factor, preferably not tied to SMS. All those basic things can really save you in the long run. So yeah, two-factor is seriously important. Put it on everywhere, and do not use your phone number. SIM swap attacks are one of the easiest attacks in crypto. They happen all the time. They're nearly undefendable because phone carriers just give over your information like they're candy to whoever asks for them. They don't care. Don't trust them to care because they're not going to. And plan ahead. Understand how you would respond in the event of attack and the time it happens. A few minutes or hours or whatever you can, all that time can make a big difference in terms of your ability to respond to an ongoing attack and stop it in its tracks or at least limit the damage, versus if you're not prepared at all, you're going to just be scrambling and you're going to panic and it's going to be much harder to deal with. So think about it. And this is a big one, and most people at this conference probably don't need to be told it or will be told this many ways, but if it's not your keys, it's not your crypto. If it's online and you don't control those keys, it's just vulnerable. And if you have more crypto than the cost of a hardware wallet, and nowadays you can get hardware wallets pretty cheap. I mean, I see them on sale for like $10 sometimes. You really have no excuse not to buy a hardware wallet. It's the best investment you can make if you're going to have even a little bit of crypto, and in the long term, you will absolutely appreciate that. All right, so the next one, I'm going to talk a little bit about a well-known hack that happened to our company at ShapeShift. And there's actually a much more longer form article, if you're interested about this, called Looting of the Fox Online, that you can read it. But as someone who was in the middle of it, I thought it would be useful to go a little bit through it from my perspective. So as this title says, these were some of the worst weeks of my life. I do not look back upon them fondly, but I did learn a lot from it. So as the story goes, I actually woke up one day and I was in charge of managing a lot of our wallet infrastructure. And in ShapeShift's case, we were constantly having to essentially fill up our hot wallets and balance with exchange wallets. And this was a constant process that we had to do. This is mostly automated nowadays, but in the early days and when this happened, it was not mostly automated. So I was personally looking at this stuff all the time. And I noticed one morning, hey, we have 315 Bitcoin, approximately, less than we should. And going through our logs, realized that some large transaction that it should not have been sent had been sent out of our wallet. and instantly we started investigating this. So I talked to our CEO, informed him of what was going on, and we started an internal investigation into this. Pretty quickly, looking at it and just knowing what happened on the server, facts and circumstances led us to believe that there was a high probability that this was some sort of inside job. It didn't seem likely that this was an outside attack, and we had particular points of evidence that pointed at one particular employee. We were not a very large company at this time, so it wasn't too hard to narrow down, and we had suspicions. The smoking gun was as we were actually sitting and investigating all of this in the office and trying to do forensic analysis on our servers, this guy who we suspected, literally right in front of us, started removing things off that server. And this was obviously a key factor in that whenever you're doing a forensic investigation on any server, you should never be removing anything. And this dude was deleting his SSH keys to try to cover over the evidence that he ever had access to that server. And based on everything else, it became pretty clear that this was probably the thief right in front of us. So what did we do? First, we were trying to figure out what was he thinking? Like, how could he not think this would be obvious? Maybe like he could have done this in such a number of ways. He could have leaked Bitcoin from us small bits at a time over a long period of time, and it would have been much harder to detect, but he just sent one big transaction. In retrospect, I don't know that he was thinking about it all that well, but he did it, and we had to confront him about it. So we actually kind of had to rehearse, how are we going to talk to him about this? How are we going to confront him? I ended up having a conversation where I essentially asked him directly about this, and I pointed to the evidence that was obvious about how he did it. He denied it all flat. Eric even gave a chance for basically anyone, we knew it was him, to return the Bitcoin and to walk away from this, but he did not take it. That was kind of all of the immediate actions we took, and at this point we had to start getting legal and all these things involved, and he obviously knew we were on to him, and I don't think we ever saw him actually again after this point. So we didn't have an easy way to get the Bitcoin back. We were kind of screwed on that part other than looking at legal means, and that was going to take a long time. But in the meantime, we still had a business to run, and we were in the middle of this. This all occurred over the course of like a single day. So we started locking down and rebuilding the parts of our infrastructure that we thought he had compromised, and we went from there. We operated after that for about 3 weeks without issue. So we thought we were past this. It really sucked. We had lost the Bitcoin. We were going to try to get it back legally, but we didn't know anything else was wrong. We thought we would be good going forward. Now, unfortunately, this kept going on. About 3 weeks later, I woke up and again discovered large amounts missing from our hot wallets, this time both Bitcoin and Ethereum. And instantly, we thought it was probably related, but we didn't know how this happened, and this guy had been gone and had all his access removed, so we didn't think it was that. We again started investigating internally. We can't find any obvious evidence this time, so we deal with that fact, and we move on. And after we couldn't figure out what was going on, our reaction was to just rebuild all of our infrastructure in 24 hours, which was a crazy task that we were even able to do that. And honestly, in retrospect, was a red flag of, if we didn't know what happened, we probably should not be doing that either. But we went ahead, we thought, at the very least, if there's something he still has access to, this will get rid of him, and we should be good. But then it happened again the next morning. So clearly, rebuilding the infrastructure had not solved the problem. And we still didn't know what was going on. We had to shut everything down. We knew we weren't going to be able to run for a while, and this is when we started calling for professional help. We ended up actually calling Michael Perklin, one of the organizers of this conference, who's now our CISO, but he was not at the time, and he came in and was helping us investigate this. So the first thing Michael had us do was kind of slow everything down and start interviewing all the staff. What did we know? What happened? Just trying to get a lay of the land and not reacting too quickly. This led to a long nights, grueling sessions of these interviews, trying to get to the bottom of what possibly could have happened. And we really didn't know at this point. We had a few theories, but we didn't know how these subsequent 2 hacks had happened. And we started at this point plans for a more safe rebuilding of our infrastructure. So we had a theory that we ended up confirming, but the prevailing theory was that some type of rat fit the profile. And a rat, in this case, is a remote access Trojan. And it's essentially just a piece of malware that gets on someone's computer and gives them more or less total remote access to it. So we didn't think this was the case originally. This probably should have been something we thought about after the first hack, particularly because that inside employee had physical access to all of our machines at the time, and we didn't know what he might have done with that physical access. So, the more we thought about it, the more this made sense. And this led us to a decision that was definitely good in the long run, which is that we had to throw out all of our local equipment and be much more slower and methodical in our rebuild and really think this through. So even something like using the same computer that we thought had nothing to do with the hack, we couldn't assume anything. We had to get rid of everything, essentially burn all of our local equipment, get fresh new ones from the store. We couldn't assume anything, but that was one of the mistakes we made in those original rebuilds. We ended up confirming this theory because this hacker, who called himself Rovion, and you can learn more if you read the story online, we actually got in contact with, and he started talking to us, and he actually confirmed that this former employee had essentially sold him access to both a set of SSH keys as well as access to a computer that he had installed a RAD on. And that had allowed him to access it, and that basically confirmed everything we were starting to be led to believe as part of this forensic investigation. So we took that very seriously. We moved on. We burnt all our local stuff. We started up anew. And we actually had an interesting back and forth with the hacker where we more or less were able to buy back a portion of our funds at pennies on the dollar because he knew he was not going to be able to easily move them. And we had a bunch of friends in the industry shutting down his movements at various exchanges when he tried to. So we were actually able to get some of the funds back, but it cost us a little bit more. And actually, during one of these times, we actually needed Bitcoin to send to him, and it was a very time-sensitive thing because obviously neither side really trusted each other. And I actually had a personal ledger that I was trying to use, and right at that moment, when I was trying to send and we were trying to complete this negotiation, my ledger just randomly wiped itself. And I had to scramble and find the seed and recover everything all within an hour's period of time, going crazy after weeks of this whole event. It was a very crazy time. So we finally remediated it for real. We locked down and rebuilt all our infrastructure much safely. It took us a lot longer this time. Doing it in 24 hours, again, probably not the best idea. It ended up taking us a few weeks to rebuild it safely. And once we were back up and running, we thought we were pretty good. Sorry, I can't even read that. So many weeks, we lost some assets, but overall, because of ShapeShift's model, and you can read about this, we didn't lose any customer funds, which was one of the first hacks to ever have that happen, where we didn't lose customer funds, and we ended up just losing time. So some things I learned from this whole incident. One, response time cuts both ways. Response time and thinking things through during a crisis can make all the difference in your outcome. Every moment matters, but responding too quickly can also lead to grave mistakes. So you have to in a crisis, you have to walk this fine line of you want to respond as quickly as you can, every moment matters, but you also don't want to overreact and do things you might later regret because you didn't think things through enough, like rebuilding all of your infrastructure in 24 hours because you don't know what the problem is. Always look inwards. Almost always an inside job should be considered in the event of a hack, especially against a company, is the first theory to eliminate. And everyone should be suspected and cleared, no matter what trust level you have of them. More often than not, this is what has occurred. And I've seen this play out numerous times with other exchange hacks. 9 times out of 10, some inside actor is involved. And that should always be the first place to look because they have the most access, and it's just the easiest place. They often will work with outside actors, just like happened in this case, but a lot of times the source is inside, and it's really easy to get attached to the people you work with and assume that they're never going to do anything to harm you, but you just can't assume that in this industry. It's too easy to get access to irreversible cryptocurrency and send it in a way that you're never going to see it again. So resist the urge to just rebuild it all. Try to actually identify the root cause, because if you don't, you're likely going to cause yourself more work, and you're just going to basically cause a frenzy that doesn't solve anything. And finally, always expect Murphy's Law. Expect things to go wrong in crunch time, because they almost always do. When you really need them to go right, they probably won't. Have contingency plans, take deep breaths so you don't overreact. One thing I've learned during this crisis, but also another crisis, which is kind of relates to this first point, is that In a crisis, while there is urgency, you usually have more time than you think you have. The urgency that you feel is almost always like a form of frenzy and panic, and you always want to take a deep breath, slow yourself down, and move a little bit slower than it feels like you should, because you'll probably make better decisions. Okay, so back to talking a little bit about forks and how human issues lead to technical ones. So talking a little bit, as we did about the DAO at the beginning, this was really emblematic when the DAO hack happened of a philosophical split between what became the ETH and ETC camps. You had one side, a faction of people that really believed that Ethereum was this early experiment, and through various reasons, we needed to really protect what happened to these people and make sure they got their money back. And then there was a whole other camp of people who thought immutability was so important that you, even in a case like this, even this early on, you should not do anything about it. So I don't know that this has ever really been answered in the community. Clearly, we have market data about what people think about it, and Ethereum is worth significantly more than ETC, even with it being down today. So that tells us something, but in the long run, it's still not really clear about how important that is. I would argue that it seems in retrospect like ETH made the right decision at the time, but only in the long run will we really know that. And at the time, this was being debated. The Ethereum Foundation supported a hard fork. I think I remember being on a call with them when they were discussing this, and a lot of their concern did come from things like regulatory and PR concerns. That definitely played a factor in their decision, and I think they rightfully thought that if they didn't do something about it, like the regulatory hammer was going to come down that much quicker and harder than it otherwise would, it'd be terrible PR, all these things. So they really supported this fork, but the interesting thing about these communities is just because, you know, one of the main foundations involved, in this case the Ethereum Foundation, supports it, that doesn't just make it so. So I actually remember a lot of these actors talking to us and telling, especially a number of us, the exchanges who were working at the time, to not worry about it, that it was very clear that Ethereum was going to fork. There was no likelihood that this other thing that people were starting to call Ethereum Classic was going to survive, and there was just no reason to worry about it. So this whole thing that people were talking about called replay protection, don't worry about it. It's not going to happen. Well, fortunately, we did not take that stance at ShapeShift. We assumed, well, if there's any chance of a split, we should prepare. And we started doing things to actually separate the coins. This is because of this theoretical replay attack, which I'll talk about in a minute. The political winds were blowing multiple directions. The Ethereum Foundation had this one view. Again, they were very convinced that there should be nothing going on with this other fork. But there were certainly others in the community starting to happen, and what we call Bitcoin maximalists were also starting to pile on kind of an attack on Ethereum as a way to kind of disrupt the community. The reality is when the fork originally happened, ETC did look dead on arrival. There was very few blocks for the first number of days. I think it took them almost a full day to get that first block, and it didn't look like anything would happen. And it kind of looked exactly like the Ethereum Foundation told us it would. But then something happened that nobody really had predicted at the time, but probably should have been predicted. And that was one major exchange, Polenix at the time, added an ETC market. And all of a sudden, we just saw this tidal wave of effects on the industry. This one action by this one company created an entire movement of economic proportions because everyone wanted to get access to their ETC now. They wanted to send it. Miners now wanted to mine the thing because there was a reason to, and there was a way for them to sell it. And other exchanges now had pressure from their own customers with all this pent-up demand to also add markets to it because now it was trading like crazy on this one exchange. So that decision caused this cascade of effects. And again, I want to be very clear, this was a very human decision. This has nothing to do with the code, nothing to do with the tech. This is just people that made a decision and caused all these effects on the industry that have been long-lasting. A lot of people wanted to blame Polo at the time. I personally am not so much in that camp because I think if it wasn't Polo, it probably would have been someone else. There was just too much pent-up demand. We were going to see it one way or another. And this made the reality of what we call replay attacks very real. So the major effects of this were that now a user could send one type of asset, ETH, and accidentally send the other type of asset they didn't necessarily know they had, ETC, because people could essentially replay any transaction on one chain on the other, and this caused all sorts of problems. Coinbase ended up losing a bunch of money because they weren't prepared for this, and they actually had a bunch of attacks on them. Users were confused as all hell. I remember having all these support nightmares, and then a whole industry popped up of people trying to offer solutions to help you safely split these things. But because this was a big lesson in forks in general, of that, with a contentious fork, there's always a chance. There's always a chance. I never say never. And as part of that, you should always be asking this question, especially if you're running a business from a technical side of, is replay attacks a potential thing here? And if they are, how do we protect ourselves against it? So we actually at ShapeShift released for a short period of time something we called an ETC splitter tool that tried to make this easy for customers, but we only ran it for a short period of time. So the second part of this is that we actually saw, interestingly enough, a lot of these lessons learned later on when there was a fork of Bitcoin. This happened about a year later where we had the split between Bitcoin and BCH. I am not going to rehash much of the scaling debate. No, it's all right. I just hit the wrong button. That's all right. We're going to go through this. But the point being, I'm not going to rehash much of the scaling debate here. There's millions of articles. You can find that online if you're interested about the different viewpoints of Bitcoin and BCH. But the point is that this was, again, a philosophical and psychological split at the core of this disagreement. A lot of developers would want to say, no, it's just technically this way, or it's technically that way, or just clearly, and some of them might have good arguments one way or another, but it doesn't really matter ultimately, because if you have enough humans believing something, whether or not that belief is based on any sort of justifiable reality, it has an effect on these crypto assets. All it takes is belief. So we saw these kind of slippery slope arguments on both sides that I'm not going to rehash, but they started getting very heated. At one point, it looked like there was a chance of a compromise, but as happens in these kind of things that become political, tribalism took over. Each side digs in their heels, and what we ended up with was the split between Bitcoin and BCH. Now, one thing that was good about this, though, is at least the people who created BCH learned the lessons from ETC, and they added replay protection, which is something, if you think ahead of time, is not very hard to add to a fork. This was a really good decision on their point, and it made BCH actually more likely to survive in the long run, because if it didn't have that, I think you would have had so many other issues that exchanges would never have thought to support it. There was still some chaos with that fork, but far less than what we saw with ETH and ETC. Overall lesson from this is that replay is really good for no one but attackers. If a fork's going to happen, I've never seen a good argument for why you would want to include replay in your fork. It's much, much better to add that protection. It's not that hard. It's a ton of work on industry actors to not add it, and it adds all sorts of confusion, and it's usually not that hard to actually fix. So, lessons from dealing with these type of forks is replay's real bad. With any potentially contentious hard fork, this should always be one of the first questions that you ask, especially if you're running any sort of company or doing any sort of development. Is there replay protection? And if the answer is no, you should be worried, and you should be thinking ahead of time of how you're going to deal with that, because it's going to be a pain in the ass. Respond ahead of time with forks. Find a way to separate clean funds if there's not going to be replay protection, and often there might even be business opportunities from these type of events. Users will be utterly confused. Please try to help them, and don't just expect them to figure it out on their own. They never, ever will. Humans really matter. As I keep trying to emphasize through a bunch of these stories, we are nowhere near a point where all that matters is the tech. The impact of philosophical, psychological, economic, and political underpinnings of public blockchains cannot be removed and will continue to have long-lasting impacts. Don't ignore this reality. Just because you don't agree with someone, again, if they have enough people that ascribe to a belief, those beliefs can change economic outcomes when it comes to blockchains. Okay, so for a little bit of a left turn here, I'm going to talk a little bit about trying to get an audit in crypto for crypto companies. This is something we've had to deal with at ShapeShift, and it's much harder than it should be. I will just kind of impart a few lessons from having to deal with this. So ShapeShift Finance Department has been trying to get an audit since at least probably 2016. We're still working on it today. Auditors are still generally, I kind of cut off, but they're just getting comfortable with this. They're not really there yet. And just getting accepted, this is one of the things that, as someone who had never run a company that needed an audit before, just blew my mind. Just getting an auditor to accept you as a client itself can take many years and cost you hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, just to get someone to say, okay, yeah, we'll do it. That's incredibly difficult. And find the right partner. Be careful of paying to teach everything to this person, because, or whoever your auditors are. Teaching about your system is fine, but teaching too much in general crypto tech is a waste of your time usually, and you will pay for it. We actually went through this ourselves with one of the big four accounting companies that I won't name and disparage, but essentially we spent many months paying $450 an hour, and we realized after a number of months, hey, we've done nothing but pay $450 an hour to teach these people about crypto. And then they would swap out the people that would show up at a meeting, and we'd have to teach them all over again. And we essentially dumped them after a few months of that, because there's really no reason that you should be paying to teach basic things about the tech. It's just not worth your time. So don't do it. One thing to pay close attention to as you're trying to get an auditor to accept you, much less audit you, is the uniqueness of your setup. So key setup and controls really matter. Do you have a few keys, or like ShapeShift, do you have millions of keys? That can make a big difference in the complexity of your audit. Different types of assets. The more assets you have, the more complicated it's going to get, especially if you're dealing with anything that's not a UTXO coin. ETH's okay at this point, but in ShapeShift's case, we had dozens and dozens of assets and different types of assets, and this really added a lot of complication. Made it very hard to get auditors comfortable. So in our case, we basically came up with a plan with our auditor where we weren't going to try to, it was going to be ridiculous to ask for millions and millions of signatures on all these various addresses that we owned, but we could at least get them to agree to signing a subset of those addresses that they chose across a wide variety of chains as ways to prove that at a point in time we had the funds that we said we had. And this may require writing scripts to automate the signing if you're dealing with as many keys as we are. Hopefully, you might not be. Really? Oh, I guess so. That's wrong. So the other thing to watch out for with audits, one of the hardest parts are third-party problems. So potentially the hardest part of this is that, especially if you rely on like other exchanges or other people that you might have funds with, them getting you the data you need for your audit is probably very hard. And in our case, we did so many trades with these things that we would actually break their systems when we tried to ask for a report. It would just totally break. They might not have even kept the data that long. It caused all these various problems. So think about that ahead of time. Where will you need these reports? Actually contact these people, work with them, because you don't want to deal with it in the midst of an audit. Yeah, it's hard. All right, so I'm going to skip that part, talk a little bit about this. So lessons from that, if you ever need an audit, and if you're a venture-funded company at some point, if you want to go to a Series B, Series C, you will need one. Start early. Think about it now. Start trying to work on client acceptance. It might take you years. You don't want to be doing that, on the eve of needing to try to raise your Series B and all of your investors demanding an audit. Don't pay to teach people. It's not worth your time. It's expensive. Key setup has a large impact. Pay close attention to it. Think hard about your key setup and what is unique about it so that you can explain that well to your auditors. And don't let third parties be your gotcha. This is where a lot of audits fall apart in crypto. Think about this ahead of time. You may even need to set up a system where you are pulling reports periodically so that you don't break an exchange when you try to pull your millions of trades down. Don't wait until this is a problem. Think about it ahead of time. Because of the whole fire alarm thing, I think I'll cut this slightly short, and I'll do one more section here. Let's get my final two. So one is I just wanted to talk a little bit about where blockchains can be really strange in terms of development. At ShapeShift, we have this saying that has proved true, and it's the edge cases are endless. And we really mean this in that, like, the further you dig into things, the more edge cases you find. They never seem to come to a stop. Even a fork can be a snowflake, as I said here. The edge cases are endless really holds true over and over again. And one thing to pay attention to, especially if you're trying to support multiple assets, is not every digital asset actually runs on a blockchain. There's a number of native tokens in the industry that do not run a blockchain. Things like Ripple, things like IOTA, they have entirely different systems. They won't conform at all. Think about this ahead of time before you integrate. And the varying speeds of blocks can affect finality quite a bit. You know, in Bitcoin, we say that's generally 6 blocks for finality. That can be about an hour approximately. In Ethereum, it's debatable, but it's generally less than that. Pay close attention to these things because they can really bite you later. One thing I always tell people too is be careful of something as simple as like a coin rebranding. We've seen this before at ShapeShift where just a simple symbol change can break everything in your system. So in one of the early days, we saw Darkcoin renamed to Dash, and that symbol change broke all of our systems for a good day before we figured out what the heck was going on. And it was just because the exchanges that changed it didn't tell anyone they were making it ahead of time, and we had to react. Be very aware that these technical edge cases can really cost you. They can cost your users time, they can cost you money. On the Ethereum chain, we have seen all sorts of problems over time with nonces being correctly formed. This has been mostly solved, but when we get really clogged chains on both Bitcoin and F that we have seen, this can really be the difference in things working, and you're thinking about this ahead of time. I can go into all sorts of stories with this that I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to right now, but things like the Bitcoin fee debate that have happened, all the fees there, ICOs on the Ethereum chain, and of course, everyone's favorite CryptoKitties, which clogged the chain with these kitties for weeks at a time and caused almost every service in the industry all sorts of problems because of these cute little pictures of cats. Be aware of the nuances of what I call secondary modifiers, and these are sometimes various chains need something in addition to an address. So in Monero, this was called a payment ID for a while, or you couldn't figure it out. Ripple had destination tags. BitShares had something called a memo. These were all things that added extra problems for the UX for your user, made it more complicated, more likely to screw up, but was also necessary for interacting with it. Even something like the limit of the amount of addresses you might get from a UTXO coin, sometimes with certain forks, this isn't handled right, and you might have unintended consequences. We saw this with Decred at one point when we first integrated it, and a problem with this limit ended up giving us addresses that we had already reused because it just started cycling through addresses rather than creating new ones as it was supposed to. And this caused all sorts of problems and led to some loss of funds. So be careful of things like that. And finally, be very careful of attacks on one implementation of a node when that particular blockchain might have multiple implementations. So the classic case of this is Ethereum, which the two longest serving nodes are called Geth and Parity. And during DevCon 2, which I was at in Shanghai, there were various attacks on the Ethereum network. And at first, one of them only affected Geth. So if you had failover to Parity, you were fine. And then a second attack affected Parity, but not Geth. So anyone who chose one or the other got kind of screwed by this attack, but anyone who had set up infrastructure ahead of time to fail over one or the other as necessary was more or less protected against it. So pay attention to things like that. Finally, coin communities. Early days of Ethereum, we saw this a lot. They would constantly put things up, and they wouldn't necessarily test them that well, and a bunch of services would put that node up and be like, oh great, thanks, that just broke everything. Expect every new node to break your shit, basically. Don't expect it to just work. Coin communities do not necessarily test anything at scale or in production environments. They just kind of assume it will work. The larger coin community, the longer lasting, the less they'll do this, but especially at first, this is very common. And they're all different. They all have their kind of different philosophy. They have their different communication styles of how they communicate. The more you're trying to keep up with, the harder this is, but truly get to know the coin community and their developers. Yeah, so you can tell a lot about assets by the community of the participants. You can learn a lot about Ethereum by the people who are involved in it, and the same with Bitcoin, and the same with other assets. Don't ignore that. So I'll kind of leave off with just a few lessons from this. Again, the edge cases are endless. This can't be said enough. If you take nothing else away from any of this, take this one. Think through potential problems carefully, try to account, but be prepared to react, because whatever edge cases you've dealt with, there's going to be another one you haven't thought of at some point. A digital asset is not necessarily equal that it's on a blockchain. Know the differences and challenges between when you're actually working with the blockchain or not. They respond differently, have different philosophies, and spawn very different types of edge cases, back to the first problem. Every change is an opportunity to break your shit. Look out for major changes like rebrands or new nodes, and of course, just assume that these are probably going to break. Be surprised when things work well, not when they break you. You should just expect things to break, be happy when they don't. And finally, these chains, until we find good solutions to scaling, they're going to keep getting clogged. This is still a problem in Bitcoin and Ethereum. It'll be a problem tomorrow if the markets exploded again. At some point, this will hopefully be fixed, but for the moment, assume the inevitability of clogged chains when building and how you will mitigate. These type of problems are far more persistent and common than just the edge cases. So I'm going to skip ahead since time's gotten a little weird. These are things I was going to talk about with 51% attacks. We're just going to kind of go through them real fast. Hold on, I'm just going to do this. We're just going to go to my last slide. I'll open it up. So this is one that I like to put up there. If you take nothing away from this, this is one of my favorite quotes. Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. Look at your convictions, especially when looking at blockchain technology and the people around you and their convictions, because the convictions are likely where the problems actually lie a lot of the time. And people really believing something or really believing for something like, for example, that a fork's not going to happen or an edge case is not possible, usually means they are. So question everything about your convictions and try to apply that to how you approach blockchains. And with that, I'll kind of come to an end of this talk, and I thank you all for joining me. Thanks.